you have seen the first 3 parts of this movie series, you would have seen many news stories and news views coming from others concerning the Jeremy Mayfield vs. NASCAR lawsuit and issues that I call the Mayfield Massacre. If you heard me in the end of part 3, you would have learned that I have a fear of how this would end for Mayfield himself because of the fate of another driver. And for those who didn't, no, I do not mean Tim Richmond. The driver, named Kevin Grubb, died 3 days before the Mayfield Massacre even began. He died by suicide. Because of the searches I did to try and figure his death out, much like the searches I did with the death of Ray Combs, the things I've learned made me start fearing for Mayfield, and for good reason, as you will hear. Let me explain what my Kevin Grubb searches unlocked first. Kevin's original suspension was in 2004. He was dejected about the situation. A NASCAR.com article had him saying, quote, "When they said I failed a drug test and was suspended indefinitely, honestly, it felt like my life was coming to an end." End quote. A post from his now defunct website said that he needed encouragement from the fans, saying, quote, "Kevin needs our help now. He is no better, and in fact probably worse than in February. He looks terrible, and is basically a dead man walking. I'm afraid he will not be here much longer if his fans don't come together and save him from himself. Most of his friends and family have given up. We cannot allow this young man to self-destruct." End quote. It was a little over 2 years later he returned to the NASCAR world. An article talking about his return had him quoted as saying, "Thought of coming back wasn't even in my head until I knew I was ready to come back. I went through a whole lot before I made the decision. I wanted to make sure I was right before I took that second chance." End quote. However, 3 months after his return, a wreck at Richmond, his home track nonetheless, resulted in more controversy. After crashing out of lap 1 of the nationwide race, NASCAR supposedly wanted him to take a drug test, part of the agreement of his reinstatement. Supposedly he refused. Keyword supposedly. NASCAR suspended him for that. My buddies and I found out about his suspension from the New Hampshire Truck Series pre-race show a week later. I remember that because of the fact that Adam Alexander said Casey Atwood's name instead, getting my buddy Meredith angry at him. Anyway, the report said he violated the substance abuse policy, telling us he failed a test. Problem! It turned out Kevin suffered a concussion from the wreck and was unaware about the refusal due to the concussion's effects on his mind. Despite all that, NASCAR basically stood its "I'm right, you're wrong" stance. 2.5 years later, Kevin was gone, found dead at the Alpine Motel a few miles from the Richmond International Raceway. I myself learned about his death the day after, and later that day it was revealed that his death was a suicide, which many claim was one of 2 possible scenarios. The parts about his NASCAR.com comments, the post on his site, and even the concussion situation, all of that I found out during a search after his death. Here's something else I found out. A suicide expert named Kevin Caruso says that over 90% of all suicides are caused by some form of suffering from a mental illness, most commonly depression. A lot of posts from multiple forums discovered during my search have people saying that Kevin suffered from depression. With what I have learned about him, something in my mind says that Kevin's depression started with the death of one of his best friends, Adam Petty, in 2000. Kevin Caruso's site says that substance abuse is a common sign of depression. Grubb's suspension in 2004 was, for most likely, his idea of an escape from his depression. Before 2004, Grubb's hopes of getting in the Cup Series were ruined by a sponsorship deal that fell through with Team Bristol Motorsports. That might have accelerated his depression too, maybe having a sense of failure. To return to the NASCAR world, Grubb had to go through treatment for substance abuse, and he did. But after his return, the evils of NASCAR raged him out, at his home track, while suffering from a concussion, which can actually make depression worse. Kevin offered a test after figuring out about the suspension, which NASCAR declined. This unfortunately made Kevin's depression even worse. The fact of the matter is, Kevin was able to beat the drug use that was caused by his depression, but he was never able to beat the depression itself, and eventually took his life. Because of Kevin, I worry about the mental health and safety of Jeremy Mayfield. Now, for those of you in the NASCAR world, ask yourself this. In retrospect, should the NASCAR world have done more to help Kevin Grubb? The obvious answer to this question is yes, Because of this, we must stop the Mayfield Massacre. We must try to help and save Jeremy Mayfield before the same fate that happened to Kevin Grubb happens to Jeremy. Jeremy Mayfield has a death rage against him that has affected him deeply, the death of his father Terry Mayfield in 2007. According to legend, his death was also a suicide. I say according to legend because Jeremy does not think his father died by suicide. One article I found during a search said, quote, "After his father died, Jeremy Mayfield hired a private investigator. He later told a sheriff's investigator that Lisa may have had an affair, had spent large sums of money, and that there should be an investigation into whether his father had been murdered, according to a December 20th, 2007 report of the investigation." Another issue is the fact that Jeremy's grandmother Lillian died 2 years before Terry. Via J-Ski, I also found out that in terms of the days, both Lillian and Terry had the same birthday, January 27th. Also in terms of days, their deaths were pretty close. Both deaths were in September of their respective years. Lillian's was on the 8th, while Terry's was on the 5th. Like Kevin Grubb, it is widely believed that Jeremy was also screwed by NASCAR in terms of the drug testing policy. If the situation persists to the point where everything goes wrong for Jeremy, despite everything he is trying to do, like one fan on the internet said, NASCAR could sentence him to the fate of Kevin Grubb. Mayfield's connection to Grubb goes deeper than just NASCAR suspending them and having their suspensions being compared to Tim Richmond's suspension in the late 1980s. Consider this. In addition to this, Mayfield and Grubb have the following in common. Both have suffered a loss of a family member or friend which affected them deeply. Both have suffered a concussion at least once in their racing careers, which does have a negative effect on a person's mental state, especially if they have some sort of mental illness, like depression. Both of their final NASCAR races took place at Richmond. In both of their final races, both of them had a crash in between the start-finish line and turn 1. And unlike most other suspensions of other drivers, most fans declared their suspensions not legit, not fair, an error of judgment, a mistake, an injustice, whatever you want to call it. It was judged as wrong. If and when this thing involving the lawsuits end, it is obvious that Mayfield will need help. However, if this thing goes the way I fear, Mayfield will need help to recover not from drug abuse, but from depression, especially if NASCAR gets everything their way. I am hopeful that you guys have learned through my searches and what I have learned that Mayfield is in more danger than you think. This has gotten out of hand. Mayfield will do whatever he can to prove to everyone that he is not a meth addict. And NASCAR will do whatever it takes to prove to everyone that they are right, even if they're absolutely positively 100% wrong. Like the Tim Richmond case long ago proved, like many people believe with this case, like the tragic scenario involving Kevin Grubb proved. I refuse to see the same thing that happened to Kevin Grubb happen to Jeremy Mayfield. I will not see what NASCAR did to Kevin take its toll on Jeremy bad enough where it gets to the point that the pain within Jeremy takes him out emotionally, mentally, and then physically. I don't care what has to be done as long as it gets done. Jeremy needs our support in the worst way and in every sense of the word. If you're with me in terms of this, then you will, whether by spirit or by meeting and communicating with Jeremy himself, give him all the help, support, love, care, and encouragement he needs to get through this battle with the evils of NASCAR. And regardless of the outcome, the depression that Jeremy will surely suffer from, if he isn't suffering from it already. I will not see the Mayfield Massacre be fulfilled. We must, and hopefully stop, the Mayfield Massacre. And that's my final answer.